Hello, this is Professor McDermott. Well, it's a little after 8 p.m. on a rainy Friday evening, and I'm at home and recording this lecture for all of you, the wonders of modern technology. Um, this lecture's topic is the settlement of the New England colonies, the English colonies in the region we now call New England. And there were some similarities between the settlement of New England and the settlement of Virginia. For example, Massachusetts, like Virginia, was settled by a business corporation called the Massachusetts Bay Company. But that is where the similarities end, because in Massachusetts and in the other New England colonies, the main motive for settlement was religious. Um, and it's not quite correct, as we'll see, to say that these colonists came for religious freedom, but they did come because they wanted to practice their own religion in their own way. Um, these were people known as Puritans in England, and they came to New England to find a place to express and to live out their Puritan faith. And as we go forward, we'll get deeper into what that meant. The first of the Puritan colonies was known as Plymouth. So let's start with the Plymouth colony. But first, when we last heard from Captain John Smith, he had to go back to England in 1609 because he had been the victim of a gunpowder explosion, possible assassination attempt. But Smith remained interested in colonizing the New World for England, and in 1614 he put together an expedition, a small fleet of ships, to explore up and down the coast of what later became New England. And he had with him a ship's captain named Thomas Hunt. After a while, Smith decided to go back to England, but he left Hunt in command of the expedition. And Hunt then took advantage of the situation by attacking an Indian tribe that lived on Cape Cod in the future Plymouth colony, a tribe called the Patuxets. And Thomas Hunt kidnapped 24 of the Patuxet Indians and took them to Spain, where he sold them as slaves. And I mention this because one of those Patuxet Indians is going to come back into the story fairly soon, so please keep that in the back of your mind. The Plymouth colony was started by a group of Puritans known as the Pilgrims. First, what were Puritans? You know from the lecture we had talking about the Protestant Reformation that the Church of England by this point in time was a Protestant church. It had separated from the Catholic Church led by the Pope in Rome. But there were many people in England who thought that the English Reformation had not gone far enough. They thought that the Protestant Church of England was still too Catholic. And they objected to a lot of the aspects of the Church of England that looked Catholic to them. For example, the Church of England still had priests who wore special robes like Catholic priests, and sometimes candles and incense were used in worship. The Puritans objected to things like wedding rings, which they thought were a holdover from paganism. They objected to making the sign of the cross when a baby was baptized. They thought that was too Catholic. And so basically what the Puritans wanted to do was purify the Church of England, to purify the church of everything left that still reminded them of Catholicism. So these were radical Protestant reformers who really wanted to take the Reformation in England to a new level. And the Pilgrims were an especially radical type of Puritans. Early in the 1600s, the Puritans these Pilgrims had decided that they could no longer remain members of the Church of England as things stood, and so they actually separated themselves from the Church of England, and they went to live in the Netherlands on the continent of Europe. for more than a decade. But they didn't really like it there. They thought their children were growing up to be little Dutch children rather than English children. And they wanted to get back into English territory, but not in England. So naturally, they thought of trying to make a new colony alongside the other English colonies on the Atlantic coast in North America. And so in 1620, these pilgrims applied to the London branch of the Virginia Company to start a colony along the Hudson River, what's present-day New York State, which was within the red line on the map there of the London branch territory of the Virginia Company. And so the Virginia Company agreed, and the Pilgrims set out on their ship called the Mayflower, heading for the Hudson River. But they went off course. They went too far north, and as it turned out, they landed on Cape Cod in what's now Massachusetts. Now, they realized that they were not supposed to be there. They were supposed to be farther south, and they were out of the jurisdiction of the London branch of the company. But they liked Cape Cod, and they felt like God was telling them to stay there. And so, knowing that they needed some kind of legal basis for settling on Cape Cod, before they got off the ship, they wrote up a document that we call the Mayflower Compact. This was on November the 11th, 1620. Excuse me. And it was an agreement which they all made, well, all the adult males on the ship made with each other, and then signed to show that they all agreed with it and would abide by it. And the Mayflower Compact begins with these words: "In the name of God, Amen. We whose names are underwritten do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and of one another covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic." And so you see here a number of things going on. If we analyze that quote a little bit, you heard the word covenant. It said we covenant and combine ourselves together. And the Pilgrims, being very religious Christian people, were very aware that in the Bible there are several cases where God makes a covenant with the people of Israel. The first example of this is the covenant with Noah, when God promises not to destroy the earth again by flood and puts the rainbow in the sky as the seal of the covenant. There's also a covenant with Abraham, a covenant with Moses. Basically, a covenant is an agreement between people, but also between the people and God. And in this case, essentially, the Pilgrims were promising that they would follow God, they would try to create a society according to God's will in their Plymouth colony, and in return, they expected God to keep up his side of the agreement, in other words, to bless them, and to prosper them, and to keep them safe. So this Mayflower Compact is a covenant. It's also what political scientists call a social contract. In fact, in a way, it's the first social contract that we actually have in recorded history. The first example where a group of people starting a new society sit down and make a written document to serve as the basis of that new society. And it's through this written document that they create a civil body politic, a new political body. And so this would be very significant in world history as well as American history. And the significance for American history, I think, is that the Mayflower Compact really starts the American obsession with written documents. More than any other country in the world, our society, our system of government is based on written documents. We like to have things in writing. in black and white. Think of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, all these fundamental documents. It's really the Mayflower Compact that first sets the example for that, and really helps to create that American obsession with written documents as the basis for society. But the first winter in Plymouth was very, very difficult. They had arrived in November, so it was too late to grow crops, really, and they had very primitive shelter for that first winter, very little food. People were getting diseases, they were sick, they were dying of exposure to the cold New England winters. And actually, that first winter in Plymouth, the majority of the Pilgrims died. More than half of the settlers died. And so things looked pretty bleak. However, in early spring of 1621, the survivors were determined to continue. And so one day, some men were out scouting in the fields looking for fields that would be suitable for planting crops, when they were surprised by an Indian who came out of the forest, an Indian named Samoset, who came up to the Pilgrims and said, "Hello." And they were amazed that he knew this English word. But Samoset very quickly went back into the forest, and a while later he came back with another Indian named Squanto. And Squanto, to the settlers' amazement, began speaking to them in very good English. And they were absolutely baffled as to how this could be possible. Well, you may have guessed by now, Squanto was one of those Indians who had been kidnapped by Captain Thomas Hunt in 1614 and taken to Spain as a slave. And he served as a slave there for a period of time, but a group of kindly Catholic priests had bought Squanto out of slavery, and he was then enabled to go to London, where he got a job, worked for a while, learned English, and saved up enough money to buy passage on a ship, hoping to get back to his people in New England. And so finally he got a ship to drop him off there on Cape Cod, but he found, very sadly, that the entire Patuxet tribe, all of his family, friends, and loved ones had died of epidemic diseases while he was away. And so Squanto did what an Indian would normally do in a case like that. He went to another tribe, the Wampanoags, and got himself adopted into the Wampanoag tribe, where he became an important person within the tribe, as was Samoset. Both Samoset and Squanto were very close to the chief of the Wampanoag Indians, a chief named Massasoit. And so Samoset especially served as a go-between between the Pilgrims and Massasoit, and he helped the Pilgrims to make peace with the Wampanoags, which was very important for their survival. Squanto made an even more practical contribution. He taught the Pilgrims how best to farm in the New England environment, and especially he taught them how to use a small fish called an alewife for fertilizer, because the New England soil is very rocky, at least in Plymouth, and not particularly good soil. And so, really, Samoset and Squanto, between them, did a tremendous amount to help the settlers survive. And the Pilgrims were grateful for that, so that when the harvest came in 1621 in the fall, they had a good harvest. And to show their gratitude, they invited the Wampanoags to a celebration. A great feast that lasted a few days, and they provided squash and corn and pumpkins, and the Indians brought with them deer and turkeys. And yes, you guessed it, this was the first Thanksgiving celebration. It's the origin of our tradition of Thanksgiving Day. The Pilgrims giving thanks, primarily because they saw in all of these events the hand of God guiding and protecting them. And to the Pilgrims, the presence of Samoset and Squanto and their ability to speak English was a real godsend, and it was a sign that God was living up to His side of the covenant, and was helping the Plymouth colony to survive. But Plymouth, excuse me, Siri was hearing me talk and getting into the act there. Sorry about that. But Plymouth, of course, was not the only New England colony. The largest and most important of the New England colonies, Massachusetts, got its origins in 1628 when the first exploratory group of Puritans from England settled in Salem, which we'll talk about later in this lecture some more. This expedition was led by a man named John Endicott. This was kind of an exploratory mission sent by some important Puritan leaders to get a foothold in Massachusetts. The following year, a group of those Puritan leaders got together at Cambridge in England, and they drew up an agreement which was approved by King Charles I to form the Massachusetts Bay Company. So, like the Virginia Company, this was a business corporation with investors, stockholders. The goal was to certainly to make money off the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But as we said also, to give these Puritans a place where they could practice their own religion their own way. Increasingly under King Charles I, Puritans were being persecuted, and these people simply wanted a way out and a place to practice their faith. One interesting thing about the charter of the Massachusetts Bay Company, it didn't say where the headquarters of the company was going to be, and probably King Charles assumed that it would be in London. But the leaders of the company decided to do something a little more radical, to exploit that loophole in the charter by taking the charter and the entire company to Massachusetts. So essentially, the entire company moved lock, stock, and barrel to the colony that they were creating, and we call this the transfer of the charter to Massachusetts. Why was this significant? Well, essentially with the company and its charter so far away from the seat of the government in London, these Puritans could pretty much fly under the radar and run the colony their own way with very little supervision from the government in England, and very little interference or attempts to change or revoke their charter until much later in history, as we'll see. And so this transfer of the charter guaranteed that the Puritans would have the leeway to set up their own colony their own way. And so in 1630, a fleet of ships sailed from England to Massachusetts, the beginning of 10 years of what we call the Great Migration, in which tens of thousands of Puritans came to New England. And these Puritans did not go so far as to separate themselves completely from the Church of England. So we say they were non-separating. Unlike the Pilgrims, they still considered themselves to be members of the Church of England. However, when they got to Massachusetts, they set up their own churches, which were congregational churches. Now, the Church of England was what we call an Episcopal church. In other words, it was run day to day by bishops. Um, and a congregational church, just like it sounds, is a church where the congregation, all of the full church members together, have the ultimate power over that church. Um, these churches did have ministers, of course, but it was actually the whole congregation voting together that hired and fired the minister that made important decisions about where to build a church building and so forth. And so, really, the congregations as a whole had the final say in these churches that were set up in Massachusetts. And some historians have pointed to this as a kind of early beginning of democracy in America. I wouldn't go quite that far, but certainly it was very empowering for the members of these congregations to have so much of a say in church affairs. Well, when the charter was transferred to Massachusetts Bay, essentially the whole group of stockholders in the company became the government of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And this legislature of the colony was renamed the General Court. And the freemen of the colony, the voters in the colony, got to elect the governor. The first governor of Massachusetts was a man named John Winthrop, who served off and on for most of the rest of his life until he died in 1649, although he was defeated a few times. Most of the time he was the governor. And the freemen also elected the lower house of the General Court, the deputies, and then in turn the deputies elected the upper house, kind of like the United States Senate and House of Representatives. The assistants were the upper house of the General Court. These were the magistrates of the colony. A magistrate is just another name really for a judge or a justice of the peace. So the members of the upper house had the right to hold court, to issue judgment in legal cases, to set legal precedents in the colony. And it's interesting when we look at the freemen of Massachusetts, the voters, to examine the question, who was allowed to vote and hold office in Massachusetts? Well, Massachusetts required that in order to be a freeman, in order to vote, you had to be an adult male, but you also had to be a full church member of one of these congregational churches. And that may not seem like they're setting the bar very high, because in modern days, pretty much if you want to join a church, you can with very little hassle. But in these churches, it was actually quite difficult to become a church member. And that had to do with the idea called predestination. These Puritans were from a religious tradition called Calvinism, and Calvin had suggested that people were predestined by God either to go to heaven or hell before they were born. And so the Puritans took this one step farther, and they believed it was possible to know who was going to heaven. If you were one of the elect, you had to prove it by essentially telling your story to the church congregation, telling the whole story of your relationship with God and your life of faith. And if you convinced the congregation that you were one of the elect, one of those chosen to go to heaven, they would accept you as a fellow church member. And then and only then could you become a voter in the colony if you were male. And so this was a pretty strict test that you had to pass and that you had to follow. It's interesting, though. I mean, this obviously was a close connection between church and state in Massachusetts, but it's not correct to say that the churches dominated the whole society. Actually, ministers in the colony were forbidden to run for public office. But the basic idea of having the voters be church members was that hopefully then they would help to create a godly society, a society according to the Bible, where people treated each other according to Christian principles. That was the theory, anyway. All right. So, in many ways, the Puritan founders of Massachusetts Bay were on the same page in terms, for the most part, in terms of their religion. But there were important differences of opinion within the colony about how the government should be set up. On the one side, you have Governor John Winthrop. Winthrop believed that essentially the leaders of the colony should be the magistrates, the members of the Court of Assistants, and that once someone was elected to be a magistrate, essentially their word was law and they should be obeyed. At one point in 1645, the people of the town of Hingham, Massachusetts, actually put Winthrop on trial because they felt that he had overstepped his authority as governor in a case having to do with who was going to be in charge of their local militia, their local military force. Well, Winthrop was found not guilty, and after he was acquitted, he gave what historians call his little speech. He basically gave the people of Hingham a good talking to, and among other things he said, quote, "Being called by you, we magistrates have our authority from God, such as has the image of God eminently stamped upon it. The contempt and violation whereof has been vindicated with examples of divine vengeance." End quote. In other words, once the magistrates got their authority from God, and therefore they should be obeyed as if just as you would obey God. And people that don't obey the magistrates are likely to get punished by God. Divine vengeance is going to fall on them because they have God's power and authority on their side. Well, not everybody in the colony agreed with Winthrop's views, and there were many people who felt that Winthrop had gotten out of hand and that the magistrates had gotten too powerful, and that the people needed to have a written document, a written law code, to help protect their rights and to help keep the magistrates in check and keep them from overstepping their authority. And so a group of colonial leaders drafted a law code which was accepted in 1641 called the Body of Liberties, which was a very significant document in early American history. Actually, I could go on and talk about this all day because I wrote my dissertation about the Body of Liberties and the men who created it, but I'll have to restrain myself to just talking about some of the highlights. Among other things, this Body of Liberties protected the right of people to travel. That may not seem like a big deal, but there were many countries in the world and in Europe where many people were not free to travel. They were tied to the land and they were not allowed to leave without the approval of a lord or a king, and so forth. And so protecting the right to travel was an important innovation. Also, the Body of Liberties gave all residents of the towns in Massachusetts the right to participate in public meetings. And even if you were not a free man, even if you were not male, even if you were not free, you still had the right to go to the town meeting. If you were a woman or even an indentured servant or a slave, to go to the town meeting and to be there, and we assume to have your voice heard in the meeting, even if you couldn't vote. So that was a very important right as well. the right to, and when you were accused of a crime, the body of liberties protected the right to counsel, that is, the right to what we would later call an attorney, and the right to trial by jury. And finally, the body of liberties forbade torture in judicial cases, except in certain extreme circumstances. And again, we kind of take that for granted nowadays, but at that time in history, in 1641, pretty much every European country practiced torture extensively in legal proceedings, and so this was a very important step forward for due process of law. And this provision really was a forerunner of the provision in our Bill of Rights, as we'll see later in the course, that bans what are called cruel and unusual punishments. This is a map of colonial New England, and you'll notice right away that it looks quite different from the map of New England today. You do see Massachusetts Bay there, but you see also that the Plymouth part, it's now part of Massachusetts, was then a separate colony. You see Rhode Island there next to Plymouth. We'll talk about the founding of Rhode Island shortly. Then you see also where Connecticut is on the map today, you see two colonies, Connecticut and a separate colony called New Haven there in brown. So let's talk about the founding of these other New England colonies. New Haven, the guiding spirit of New Haven was a minister named the Reverend John Davenport. And on June 14, 1639, a group of settlers that he was leading at New Haven got together, and they had a very important meeting in which John Davenport asked them a number of questions, including the question, do you agree to be ruled and governed in all things by the scriptures, by the Bible? And to this question and all the other questions, the settlers showed their agreement by raising their hands. So once again here you have this idea of a social contract that the settlers are agreeing with each other and with God to create a colony according to the ways of God as they saw them. And New Haven was the strictest Puritan colony. Essentially in New Haven everything was done according to the Bible. So for example in New Haven they didn't have juries in legal cases because there's nothing in the Bible about having a jury, and so they simply didn't do it because it wasn't in the Bible. Connecticut, next door to New Haven, was not quite as strict as New Haven, but they were still very committed to the idea of creating a godly society. And so their fundamental document is called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, and it includes this phrase, quote, where a people are gathered together, the word of God requires that there should be an orderly and decent government established according to God, end quote. And so in other words, they too were basing their government in some sense on the word of God as they saw it in the Bible. And so you see here with all of these Puritan colonies the idea that they wanted to create a godly society. And theory, again, these societies were supposed to be based on Christian love, and the poor were supposed to be taken care of. Everyone was supposed to look out for each other. They were supposed to treat each other with justice and fairness. And in truth, it can be said that Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Haven were very nice places to be if you agreed with the Puritan leaders of the colony, if you shared their religious and political principles. However, there were, of course, some people in the Puritan colonies who did not agree, and for them, life could become very difficult. and that was certainly the case with a man named Roger Williams. Roger Williams was a Puritan minister. He was the minister of Salem for a while, but he got himself into trouble in 1636 in Massachusetts because he did not agree with the idea that only church members could be voters. He thought that that meant that the church and state were too close together, too much in cahoots, if you will. In other words, Roger Williams was one of the first people in the world who believed in a complete separation of church and state, something that many people in the U.S. take for granted now. But in 1636, that was a very radical opinion, and the leaders of Massachusetts thought it was very threatening to their colony. And so, in the middle of winter, they told Roger Williams he had to leave. And so he made his way through the wilderness during the winter cold to Rhode Island. And some of his followers joined him there, and they were the original founders of Rhode Island. And Rhode Island became a very interesting place because people who were not in sync with the Puritan leaders of the colony often wound up in Rhode Island. Roger Williams was also one of the founders of the modern-day Baptist Church because he believed that it was wrong to baptize babies. He believed that Christians should only receive baptism when they were old enough to actually know what they were doing. So he would only baptize adults. And this is one of the core beliefs of Baptist churches today. I understand students have told me that now they do baptize children as young as 9, but not infants. And the point again is that you need to be old enough to know what you are doing to accept that commitment before you become officially a Christian. And so in that sense, the Baptist Church partly owes its origin to Roger Williams. Another religious misfit who got in trouble in Massachusetts Bay was a rather extraordinary woman named Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson had in her home in Boston basically what we would call a women's Bible study group that met regularly, and that was quite common among the Puritans, wasn't anything unusual. But Hutchinson was a very intelligent woman, very well read in the scriptures, and she began sharing her own theological opinions about the Bible with the women in her group, and gradually news got out that she was teaching some fairly radical ideas. And it was said that she was telling her followers that if you were a Christian, you really didn't have to worry about following the laws of society, that you could go to heaven even if you were a lawbreaker and a bad citizen, because after all, the Puritans believed in predestination, and they believed God chose who was going to heaven or hell, and it didn't matter what you did. The only thing that mattered was God's choice. This way of thinking is called antinomianism. That means literally against law. And the Puritan fathers in Massachusetts were very alarmed by this opinion. And you can see why. If people believe in a society that they don't have to obey the law, that could lead to a lot of problems and could really damage your social order. And so the leaders of the colony put Anne Hutchinson on trial before the general court, and they too decided she was too dangerous to have in the colony, and so they sent her off to Rhode Island as well. And so, as I said, Rhode Island became a very lively and interesting colony. sort of the halfway house where all the misfits from the other Puritan colonies tended to end up. Another case where people were persecuted in Massachusetts for their personal religious beliefs had to do with another religious group called the Quakers, officially known as the Society of Friends. And we'll talk about them more extensively when we discuss the Pennsylvania colony, so I won't go into great detail about their beliefs right here. But suffice to say that they disagreed with the Puritans in many ways. In 1656, a group of Quakers came to Massachusetts trying to preach their own religious views, and the Massachusetts leaders ordered them to leave, essentially sent them into exile. But unlike Williams and Hutchinson, these Quakers were very persistent and they kept coming back. And finally, by 1660, the leadership had had enough, and they actually hanged 4 of these Quakers, solely because they were preaching the gospel in their own way, solely for their religious beliefs. Now, this brings out something very significant about these Puritan colonies. Again, sometimes people say that the Puritans came to America for religious freedom. And that's partially true, but if you think about it, based on what we've just said, you'll see very clearly that really they only wanted religious freedom for themselves, for their own group, the Puritans, to worship God in their own way. And they didn't offer religious freedom to people who disagreed with them. In fact, they persecuted and mistreated them. Historians call this the Puritan dilemma. The fact that the Puritans wanted religious freedom for themselves, but refused to offer the same consideration to other people. It's a very ironic thing about these Puritan colonies. And so you see that if you were a dissenter, someone who went against the dominant beliefs in these Puritan colonies, life could be very difficult for you. It could also be quite difficult at times if you were an American Indian, as the Pequot Indians of Connecticut found out in the year 1637. So, what triggered the Pequot War was the death of 2 English traders who had gone down to Connecticut, who were murdered reportedly by this group of Indians, the Pequots. And the Massachusetts leadership decided that this could not be tolerated, and so they sent an army down into Connecticut to attack the Pequots and punish them for what they had supposedly done. The most famous event of the Pequot War took place at the modern-day town of Mystic, Connecticut. The Pequot warriors were out on the warpath, so the young men were not at home at Mystic when this happened, but there was a fort there, the Pequots, and essentially it contained the women, the children, and the old men. Well, as you see from the illustration there, the Puritan army surrounded the fort, and they also had with them some Indian allies from other tribes who were fighting with them, surrounded the fort at Mystic, set it on fire, and then when the women, children, and old men came running out of the fort to avoid being burnt to death, shot them down mercilessly, massacring about 400 of the Pequots there in this Mystic massacre. Now you might think that the Puritans, being Christians, would be ashamed of that atrocity, but that's not the case. The leader of the expedition, John Mason, wrote about it in these words, quote, "Thus was God seen in the mount, crushing his proud enemies, burning them up in the fire of his wrath, and dunging, that means manuring the ground with their flesh. It was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. End quote. So essentially, the Puritans believed that God was on their side. They had a covenant with God. They felt that the Pequots had done something wrong to them, and so the massacre was simply God's revenge on these Indians. And so the settlers won the Pequot War, defeated the Pequots, and essentially killed or enslaved nearly all of the tribe. So essentially, this tribe disappears as a result of the Pequot War. Now, I should say that seems horrible, and it is, but most of the time, relationships between the Puritans and the Indians were pretty good. And in 1629, before they even came to Massachusetts, John Winthrop made a statement in which he said that the settlers didn't want to take all the Indians' land, only the land that they felt the Indians were not using. And that could be a tricky issue because the Indians had land they used as hunting grounds. The Puritans didn't think they were using it, but that was because it wasn't fenced in like an English farm. So there was a lot of cultural misunderstanding about what constituted using the land. But for the most part, the Puritans did buy land from the Indians. They made agreements with the Indians and paid them for land. They didn't simply take it most of the time. However, there was another terrible outbreak of hostilities that was even more violent later in the 1600s, and this was the conflict that we call King Philip's War. King Philip was the chief of the Wampanoags. He was one of the sons of Massasoit. His Indian name was Metacomet, and he had become the chief after the death of his father. Metacomet was getting very disgusted with the English settlers, somewhat like Opechancanough in Virginia. He saw that the settlements were growing, they were expanding, more and more land was being taken from the Indians. He really didn't trust the English, and especially he didn't like that the English were trying to convert the Indians to Christianity. What triggered King Philip's War was an incident in 1675 when a Christian Indian named John Sassamon went to the leaders of the Plymouth colony and said, "Hey, I've heard that Metacomet, King Philip, is getting ready to attack the white settlements." So he warned them that this was about to happen. A few days later, John Sassamon's body was found floating dead in a pond. Obviously, he had been murdered in retaliation for the fact that he had ratted out the Wampanoags. Well, the settlers rounded up 3 Wampanoag Indians whom they accused of murdering Sassamon, and they put them on trial according to English law. Now, the jury did have some Indians on it. It was half Indian, half white jury. But this jury found the 3 Wampanoags guilty of killing John Sassamon, and they hanged them as punishment for that crime. Metacomet was furious and immediately launched an all-out war with the goal of wiping out completely the Puritan settlements of Massachusetts. And this was a very brutal, very bloody war. Several towns were, in fact, completely destroyed by the Wampanoags and their allies. About 600 white settlers died in King Philip's War. But as the war went on, the tide turned against the Wampanoags, and the Indians had much heavier losses. About 3,000 Indians died as a result of the war, including King Philip, whose head was chopped off and put up on a stick in Boston as a warning to anyone who would rebel in the future against the colony. So King Philip's War ended in defeat for the Indians, and the consequences were pretty terrible for them. Essentially, Indian strength and power was eliminated, and the few Indians that remained became more and more dependent on the white settlers for their livelihood. And also, similar to what happened in Virginia, after King Philip's War, the white settlers were very angry and disgusted with the Indians and essentially lost interest in converting them to Christianity. Massachusetts was one of the few English colonies where a major effort had actually been made to convert the Indians with some success. But after King Philip's War, the Indians were seen as no longer worth it, and even those efforts diminished greatly. And so you see here that the relationships of the English with Indians were generally much worse than those of the French or even the Spanish, partly because of their reluctance to intermarry with the Indians, partly because of the large number of settlers who came to the English colonies, their greed for land, and no matter how promising a start Indian-white relations had in any of the English colonies, somehow it always seemed to go sour in due time. Well, I said earlier that when the Massachusetts Bay Company transferred its charter to the new colony, that gave them a way to really fly under the radar and do their own thing, if you will, in Massachusetts. But finally, in 1684, the English government decided to crack down on the New England colonies. King Charles II ordered that the Charter of Massachusetts be revoked. And then the following year, Charles II died, and his brother King James II came to the throne. James II went even farther and did something very radical. He took all the colonies you see there in green on the map, all the Puritan colonies plus New York and the two Jersey colonies, and combined them together into one big super colony called the Dominion of New England. So essentially he abolished the existing governments, the legislatures of those colonies that had been functioning for several decades, making laws for the people there, abolished town meetings and so forth, and appointed a royal governor named Edmund Andros to be to rule the colony on behalf of him, King James II of England. And Andros very quickly made himself extremely unpopular in the Dominion of New England. The people were very resentful at the loss of their own political traditions, and also because Andros insisted on charging rent on all the land in the colony, and collecting money as rent for all the land which went to the Crown of England. And the colonists were furious about that because they thought they had bought their own land, that they owned it. They had the deeds and titles to it, and they were furious that they had to actually pay rent on this land that they believed they owned. These rents were called quit rents. And so, in a sense, the people in the Dominion of New England were just looking for an opportunity to rise up against this very unpopular government, and that opportunity came in the year 1688, when an event took place in England that has become known as the Glorious Revolution of 1688, in which the Parliament of England, meeting as a convention, deposed King James II, primarily because he was a Roman Catholic, and replaced him with his daughter Mary and her husband Prince William of Orange, who became the rulers of England jointly, known as King William and Queen Mary, William and Mary. And as soon as the news of this glorious revolution made it to Massachusetts, the people flooded out into the streets of Boston and arrested Edmund Andros, overthrew the Dominion of New England government, and quickly reestablished their own government the way that it used to be, more or less, under their original charter. And they actually got away with this act of rebellion and the confusion of the Glorious Revolution. And so the different New England colonies did go back to having a separate existence. By this time, New Haven had been combined with Connecticut. But William and Mary were not going to let things absolutely go back to the way they had been before. And in 1691, they issued a new charter for Massachusetts that made some very important changes. First of all, this was when Plymouth combined with Massachusetts. Second, Massachusetts became a royal colony, no longer governed by the General Court, the Massachusetts Bay Company, which was abolished. The new charter meant that the crown, the king and queen themselves, were in charge of the colony. And they also required that ministers and members of the Church of England, Anglicans, be allowed to set up Anglican churches the way that they were in England. And so for the first time, these congregational churches had to allow the official Church of England to be set up in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, and the other Puritan colonies, as the other colonies also were required to do this as well. Finally, in Massachusetts, voting was no longer based on church membership, but rather on how much property you owned. And so that connection between the congregational churches and the state was eliminated under the new Massachusetts Charter. Now, it's an interesting historical fact that it was during this time of confusion and chaos, before the new charter and the new governor made it to Massachusetts, in early 1692, when in Salem Village, just to the west of Salem town, a group of girls who were connected to the minister of Salem, Samuel Parris, began to accuse some of their neighbors of witchcraft. And I won't go into great detail about this right now because we're going to have some documents that will help you to understand this more deeply. But just a little bit of background. In the 70s, a very interesting book came out called Salem Possessed, which I like a lot. And in it, the authors, Boyer and Nissenbaum, brought out that most of the accusers, the young women who were accusing people, were connected to Reverend Samuel Parris, whereas most of the victims of the accusation were linked to another family called the Porters. And there had been a sort of family feud going on for a while between the Parrises and the Porters. So that's one possible explanation for the outbreak of witchcraft. There are many others. Hundreds of books and articles have been written about the Salem witch trials with many, many different theories about what caused them. We'll explore that a little more deeply when we talk about the documents in class, but for now I'll just mention that when the new governor got to Massachusetts, he set up a special court, to try the accused witches. And this court convicted 19 witches who were executed before the ministers began to get nervous and upset about what was happening, especially since the accusers were starting to accuse more powerful people in the colony, including even the governor's wife, of witchcraft. The ministers in the colony said, wait a minute, this is getting really out of hand, and got involved and got the standards of evidence that were being used by the court changed, tightened up, so that after that point, no more witches were executed. But still, it was one of the most remarkable, one of the most deadly and tragic occurrences in early American history. But we'll get the chance to discuss this more fully in the classroom.